'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the North Pole, not a creature was stirring, except for the man approaching from the outskirts of the little town. The small but usually quite bustling village, hidden away from the world above, was always uncommonly quiet on this particular day, the last opportunity to rest before the otherwise hectic night ahead. But that's exactly why he chose this one over any other. Whether it was his madness that granted him the ability to perceive this little town, which not even global radars or satellites could pick up, or something else entirely, was not especially important. The self-appointed mission that led him out to this desolate landscape, however, was enough to make his mouth water as he glared on from the outskirts. With his bulging bag of provisions and his long, hooded, fur-lined red leather coat brushing the snow beneath his ragged boots as he took wide strides across the unpredictable terrain, he slipped a mask down over his face as he neared the darkened street at rest. Though masks are something of a necessity in his profession, this particular man could never settle on just one specific look. Oftentimes he would select something more fitting to his surroundings, from a leathery cowboy mask for the small Texas town he visited a few summers back, to a rubberized Mr. Potato Head when he ventured out to Idaho. The list goes on. But this was a special occasion. For this one, he selected something of a mockery of the man he was there to meet, the clumped and matted beard, almost dreadlocked, hanging from the cracked and weathered porcelain face beneath the crimson hood. Though he would not seek out this particular individual until later, he hoped that it may spark some fleeting familiarity to those residing within the homes which would be the first on his list. If all should proceed as he hoped, he would not be discovered until the climax of the night's festivities, until the snowy streets were stained red, something of a beautiful irony given the herald of the season's chosen wardrobe, the man thought, almost inspiring a rare smile to cross his lips, now hidden beneath the mask he had specifically selected for this task. Standing outside the small, festively decorated house, the first building past the elegant archway at the entrance to the little town, he quietly slipped the crowbar from his bag of goodies. Not only was this one of his favorite tools for getting the job done, but it would make quick work of any locked doors. In this pleasant village, though, he would quickly discover that most entrances would not require such flair, simply opening with the turn of a knob. While he was always prepared to break into the many homes he had visited through the years, he was prone to attempting an easy entry before risking any noise which may awaken his targets. Yes, it was rare that he would find any unlocked, as the world had grown quite paranoid and skittish, but not in Christmas Town, it would seem. Though uncertain if he would allow any of the residents of this hidden place to survive the night, perhaps any that should last may think about installing more security measures in the future. He would consider this a public service to any remaining denizens, a lesson in preventing unwanted entry to their homes in the wee hours of the morning. Of course, had there been locks aplenty fixed to every door, his trusty crowbar would make quick work of them. But those who may learn what he had to teach would not have the opportunity to install any locks once he was finished with them. Shaking his head as the hinges didn't even squeal, swiftly muffling the heavy sigh he couldn't help exhaling, he found himself almost disappointed that the inhabitants of this house were making things so easy for him. He was halfway tempted to stomp his feet as he strolled down the short hallway, just to grant them an opportunity to at least prepare themselves for his arrival. But this was only the first of many homes he would enter this December 23rd. As he gently pulled open the first internal door he came to, he gave an almost defeated shrug upon seeing the short and pointy-eared male and female soundly asleep on the small bed. Having assumed that he would have to rule out a few rooms to locate his prey, again, this seemed way too easy. Naturally, that did not alter his mindset. Gingerly sauntering to the bed, still keeping his footfalls gentle and soft, he just glared down on his victims, nestled together upon the mattress. Momentarily considering loudly clearing his throat to allow them to regain some semblance of awareness before he finished them off, he just shrugged again, almost theatrically, as though he had an audience. As he held his crowbar high, his mouth watering from what was to come, he felt that familiar, euphoric rush as he thrust his weapon down. With a meaty thunk, the hooked prongs almost split the skull of the small-statured female, her male companion springing upright as he peeled the blood-soaked metal free. Before the imminent scream could escape the now slack jaw of the horrified little person, the man spun his crowbar before ramming the straight and pointed end through the gaping maw. Blood spurted across the curtains alongside the small bed as the sharpened tip burst through the back of his head, the wide eyes glaring back into his, slipping loose a single tear each as the life left them. Though the first kills of the night had been so much simpler than he expected, they were really almost too easy, barely quenching his thirst. Regardless of the many more homes he had yet to visit, he couldn't stand the idea of leaving this one so unsatisfied. Thrusting his weapon of choice down on the already deceased over and over again until only bony and meaty pulp remained from the neck up, the man felt his body twitching from the rush. His extravagant coat, mask, and false beard positively caked in sticky fluids by this point, he made his way back down the hallway, trailing crimson tracks in his wake. He checked all of the remaining doors before stalking back out into the night, just to be certain that no potential witnesses may alert their neighbors. But he considered this house to be clean as he dropped those first drops of blood across the snow. Long before slaughtering his parents in his childhood home, just a little after his 13th birthday, Timothy had always been a troubled child. Even as a toddler, still learning about the exhilarating world around him, he was fascinated by the vibrant hue of the fluids running through his veins. Yes, his father was the first to reveal this particular shade of red to him, not through anything violent or abusive, but from his own clumsy hands attempting to install a new stove in the kitchen of their humble home. The young boy just glared on, with his eyes wide and trembling, as his old man held his split fingers beneath the running water of the sink. He didn't verbalize this sudden fascination, as not only were his vocal talents quite unrefined and crude at this stage of his life, but from his mesmerized gaze, transfixed to the scene before him. Susan, his mother, who could never quite handle the sight of blood, quickly attempted to rush her child away from her cursing husband, but this did not go as smoothly as she had hoped. Young Timothy completely abandoned his composure as his mother attempted to pull him from the kitchen, kicking and slapping her before biting down on the hand she wrapped around him. She shrieked even louder than her husband had from the shock of her son's actions, as much as the blood now oozing from her finger. Daniel, her husband, snatching a towel to wrap around his streaming wound, rushed to her side, turning his infuriated gaze to his son moments later. It took some yelling from both of his parents to finally convince the boy to leave the room. That, combined with the fact that they had both concealed their injuries by this point. But it was at that point that the couple understood something they had been denying for some months now. Something wasn't quite right about their child. Standing directly outside the small building he had only just cleansed, the bulky man in the blood-spattered coat cut his eyes from the next house in line to the one across the street. With such a narrow pathway between them, he could not quite decide which to invade next. After a moment of consideration, he chose to walk straight from the door to his back, understanding that it would be far more efficient to avoid having to backtrack. Upon discovering only one resident between these walls, however, he thought it more fitting to take his time with this one. Once sticky fluids lined every wall of the small bedroom, already seeping into the mattress by the time he walked back toward the outside world, the man in the porcelain mask thought he might take a minute before moving on to the next house. While he loved his work, never growing tired of his chosen profession through the years, he couldn't deny that it may have been in his best interest to have made this quick and easy. Yes, even after permanently silencing the poor, unsuspecting elf, It was completely unnecessary to remove each limb before gutting the small framed sprite. Sometimes he simply couldn't control his impulses. That being said, of course, such in-depth procedures could be quite exhausting, and there was still a good many homes to go before he reached the long-awaited climax of his trip up north. Taking a glance back at his watch as he leaned against the brick exterior of the home he had only just left, he released a heavy exhale into the chilly breeze. It would seem that he had already wasted almost an hour between only the first two buildings, inspiring a semblance of concern. If he continued to break through every door he passed, or indulged as much as he had already, the remaining residents of the small village may very well be awakening long before he was done. He had considered this over the days leading up to this, of course, that he may not be able to take them all out in time for Christmas Eve, but he had hoped to be further along before he had to mull this over. It would seem that his appetite outweighed his capacity, the hidden town seeming much larger within than it had appeared from without. Naturally, that would not stop him from spilling as much blood to the snow as he could. He just needed to be a little more selective was all, rather than wiping everyone out. Though he felt a little defeated as he began to walk deeper into the village, dragging his bag of goodies like a pouting child, he felt his spirits lift a bit when the sound reached his ears. While he had never been much of a social type, it wasn't difficult for him to understand that the somewhat muffled music echoing from somewhere up ahead was likely some sort of party. He felt his smile lifting the cold porcelain of his mask as he trudged on in pursuit of a potential assembly of victims. Sure, it might not be quite as easy for him to remain as stealthy as he would normally like, but he loved chasing down a panicked mob, even more than taking his time with sleeping prey. While it may be very possible that, when he arrived at this destination, the screams may alert others, including the primary attraction of the night, it wouldn't exactly hurt his feelings to speed along the plans he had dreamt of for some decades by this point. Whether he took out the big guy in the middle of his hunt, as opposed to the grand finale, there was still plenty of fresh meat awaiting his tools. Though Timothy had always been a quiet sort, he was so excited upon hearing the tales of the saint of the Christmas season once he started attending school. Yes, given his secret hobby that not even his parents knew about, his infatuation with cutting into the flesh of any unfortunate forest creature that should happen by his house, he was well on his way to becoming a monster. But in his increasingly demented mind, he still didn't see this as enough to be considered naughty. As far as he was concerned, all of the other school kids around him had their own hobbies: baseball, drawing, or just playing outside, and some of them were considered to be veritable angels to parents and teachers alike. Why should the things he did for fun make him any less? Some children used paint or crayons to scribble their works onto the page. He used a knife. What's the difference, really? While Daniel and Susan had never felt the need to entertain the seasonal mythology, they always made certain that their son had plenty to unwrap on Christmas morning. Over the previous 5 years of his life, they saw no reason to complicate this time of giving to one still learning more about life by the day. But when their boy came home from school that day, raving about the elusive saint of the annual holiday, the couple had a decision to make. Tell him what they considered the truth, potentially inspiring him to squash the dreams of his classmates, or just roll with it, giving credit to the man in the hat for this half-decade's worth of gifts. Ultimately, worried that their son may take it upon himself to drop some knowledge on any potential friends, likely angering them and leaving the boy an outcast, they chose to allow him to believe in Christmas magic. Like many children across the world, upon learning of the Jolly Man, as the day drew nearer, young Timothy forged his plot to stay awake on the night of the 24th to meet the fabled gift-giver himself. Between his almost out-of-character excitement and those lingering fears that something was off with their son, the Thompsons decided to play along with him on this. Not only was his joy downright infectious, but he seemed so much lighter at the time. That inherent, unsettling vibe he would generally exude, fading to a blur behind his childlike exhilaration. Timothy had always been an intelligent boy, even at such a young age, so his parents knew that it would take more than just the costume Daniel purchased to make the kid believe he was face to face with the mythical figure. Josh, Susan's brother, who had dreams of becoming an actor, agreed not only to play the part of the man in the hat, but to arrange with some friends from his theater group to apply prosthetics to his face to really sell it. That Christmas would only be the first of many, during which the boy would have the opportunity to spend some fleeting moments conversing with his idol, fully unaware of who truly wore the costume. And this sparked both jealousy and admiration in equal measures from his classmates, but also made the young man feel more special with every Christmas that came and went. Though the intentions of his parents and uncle were pure, simply just to make their child smile, they couldn't have known what this would lead to in the end. Yes, the boy was on a dark path as it was, one that likely could not have been avoided, regardless of the love his family showed him every single day. But this annual tradition would become the catalyst of his true descent when all was said and done. Having decided to skip the surrounding houses, both due to time restraints and curiosity, the man in the blood-speckled, fur-lined red coat opted to seek out the source of the ambient sounds. The deeper he paced into the small village, the louder the music and laughter grew. As the homes on either side of him came to an end, the pathway veering to either side, only leading to more streets and more walkways, he suddenly had no concern with any such residencies. His cold heart was already racing, the exhilaration of the potential victims he was approaching hastening his pulse with every step. But as he looked upon the central structure of this town, the massive, cylindrical, multi-level factory, it was quite clear that the soundtrack of which he had been in pursuit was emitting from inside. Briefly considering walking around the circumference of the enormous building just to fully take in the impressive proportions, he again understood that he hadn't time for such frivolities. Not only had he still a lot of work he hoped to accomplish, but he wished to be able to fully take his time on the night's main event. Now he could neither risk dragging his heels, nor being discovered by some potentially late visitors to whatever sort of get-together was ongoing in that factory. Besides, this next visitation could serve as a precursor to the climax of his quest. Surely he could spill enough blood to the floors and walls of this building to satiate his desires. With that, he could use less haste in taking down the one he was truly here to meet. With his impulses satisfied, gutting the jolly old bastard would simply be the icing on the cake of this most joyous night. When that was done, he could leave this place behind, along with however many of the pointy-eared helpers who may have survived without a second thought. Yeah, this would be enough. Peering through the somewhat foggy and iced-over glass of the front entrance to the gargantuan building, he could see enough to assure himself that the lobby area was empty. He still moved cautiously, gently pulling open the door, keeping his footfalls as silent as possible as they transitioned from the snowy cobblestones to the smooth wooden floor. The second he peeled open the entryway, the volume of the music from within the factory escalated dramatically, as were the somewhat high-pitched, laughing voices of those who celebrated in one of the rooms ahead. Softly closing the door behind him, taking note of the flickering red and green lights ahead and the direction from which the ambient noise of joy was echoing, the man in the crimson-stained coat had another decision to make. Straight ahead, or the scenic route. Being a bulky and muscled individual, he knew that he could easily overpower any of these small-framed, mythical creatures. But even with that fact, he was well aware that there were strength in numbers. Regardless of how much his mouth was watering at the thought of their sticky fluids raining across his goose flesh, He couldn't risk being prematurely taken down by a flock of stampeding prey. Now he had to see how many of the townsfolk were attending this party before deciding how and when to make his presence known. With that, he moved onward, not to rush the group, swinging his weapons while hoping for the best, but to find a safe spot to get a view of the crowd. Of course, as he slipped through the door to the stairwell, just back from the entrance to the room containing the soon-to-be dead ahead, he was hopeful that he may find a straggler or two along the way. Slowly creeping up the staircase, still hearing the soundtrack of the ongoing party from the other side of the wall, he was almost tempted to see how many floors this building actually had. But again, there was no time for such curiosities. As he neared the third door, since crossing through the first on the ground level, he hoped that this would be high enough to get a decent view of the party while staying hidden from view. Sure, he couldn't exactly be certain if there would be any sort of view from here, but given the nature of such a massive factory, he felt certain that there would be some sort of regular observation decks on potentially every floor. Even such a jolly boss would have to keep an eye on his troops at times, after all. As the man pushed open the entryway he had selected, not only was he almost instantly greeted with a view of the central lower deck of this building from the railing to his left, but one more unexpected surprise awaited him as well, something that immediately inspired his mouth to water again.
It took you long enough,
the petite female elf, with her back to the approaching killer, said, turning her head to glance over her shoulder.
Oh, this isn't what it looks like, boss? Is that?
Well, the only other light source on this level were the lights flickering from below, casting the shadows of both the balcony railing and the two individuals across the walls. The red-haired elven woman did not have to focus too hard to tell that this was not in fact her employer.
Who the?
She began to ask, before the man swiftly darted toward her, cupping his immense and gore-stained hand almost around her entire head. "Shh," he said, even this half-word more of a croak than actual verbalization. The tiny hands of his victim were clawing at his fingers as she writhed in his grasp, to which he just tilted his head from one side to the other, not breaking his gaze from hers. As he stared her down, considering whether to simply squeeze her little head like a lemon or digging in his bag for one of his numerous toys, the door to his back, creaking open, left him no time to make a satisfying decision.
I'm sorry it took me...
A high-pitched, trembling voice whispered.
Twinkle? Hey, who are you?
Before he could utter another word, or even hope to scream out against what was to come, the man in the blood-speckled coat closed the small gap within seconds, still holding the red-headed elf by the face. With the jaw of his next victim hanging limp, the man shoved his sizable thumb right into the gaping maw, wrapping the rest of his fingers around the back of the head. The small-framed woman howled to the best of her ability, her horrified chorus muffled by the tight grip, as the man squeezed the hand encasing the shivering male, pulling back when his thumb burst through the back of his skull, peeling away one side of the jaw with a splatter of bone and blood. The small man gurgled on his own fluids, his body spasming from the shock as the gore-soaked hand quickly moved in again. Wrapping his fingers around where the head was now gushing fluids to the red and green colored shirt, gripping down and twisting with an echoing crunch, he tore away everything above the lower jaw. He just watched as the body fell limp to the floor, still twitching as he released the portion of the skull he had claimed to drop beside the lifeless husk. The redhead was battling more frantically than ever in her attempts to free herself from a similar fate, but the man barely even reacted to her pitiful assault, only pulled open his bag of goodies with the hand still dripping blood to the carpet. With a satisfied smirk lifting the corner of his stubbled face beneath his porcelain mask, he glared from the rusted machete he pulled from the sack to the wide and horror-stricken emerald green eyes of his next victim. Her muffled pleas only fueled the intoxicating euphoria of his most recent kill, tempting the man to indulge in the sensation just a little while longer. but not enough to inspire him to drag his heels. As he held the blade high above his head, the twinkling lights from below reflecting on the tarnished steel, he allowed the watering green eyes of the elven ginger to fully take in its proportions before he twisted his wrist, flipping her head to the right, and swung the blade down on the left side of her neck. Over and over again, he thrust his blade down, even after that small fragment of life left her splayed-open eyes. Down and down again, carving from the nape of her neck to the top of the opposing hip, until the half of the body he did not hold fell to the already heavily stained carpet. Though Timothy had been more reluctant than most to abandon the tradition of belief in the fabled gift-giver, he had been on the cusp of letting go of such childish things for some time before the betrayal of his 13th Christmas. Yes, he had been well aware that it was his uncle playing the part of jolly old Saint Nick for the better part of 6 years by this point, so it was no surprise when his parents and his mother's brother had the talk with him that November. But that wasn't the only revelation that year would bring. Though he earned many wonderful gifts each and every Christmas, he was still not prepared to fully accept that at least a few of them did not come by way of the North Pole. Being an official teenager now, his parents no longer indulged him in his stubborn beliefs, but they were supportive enough to not fully pull the rug out from beneath him. In many ways, though they would never truly admit it aloud, they were slightly afraid of their son. Sure, they had him in therapy since he was around 8 years old, since they discovered evidence of the hobby which he had only refined all the more over the years, but they wouldn't let him know that they knew. As it was, the boy had never had reason to want for anything. He had a childhood that many would envy, and no shortage of love from his folks. But Daniel and Susan were absolutely right in their early unspoken suspicions. There was something very wrong with their boy. Regardless of them claiming that the therapist with whom he met every second Wednesday after school was just to help him cope with the changes of growth, a luxury that many parents could not provide their children, they claimed upon his first meeting with Dr. Brooks, he understood that they knew more about his talents than they let on. Of course, he wasn't about to reveal that, understanding that this was something better not addressed out loud, a mutually agreed upon secret between the three. He had grown far more careful over the years in keeping his craft hidden, hopeful that they would assume he had given it up with the guidance of his shrink. Sure, he had lied to the middle-aged woman when she asked about such things, claiming it to be a perfectly normal question for new patients, and he continued to lie every time she would bring it up again, but he suspected that she knew he wasn't being completely honest. In many ways, though, the woman and his parents' discoveries inadvertently helped him refine his skills all the more. He learned stealth and secrecy in refining his ability to keep the torture and murder of woodland creatures under wraps. He learned to control his emotions while lying to the face of his weakly inquisitor. He even grew stronger, working out almost religiously at school, just to be able to handle himself if he ever did get sloppy enough to be fully discovered for the monster he knew himself to be. So many things that he would not have become without the guidance of those who supposedly had his best interests at heart. Of course, even though he knew that his passion project was not normal, childlike behavior, he still believed that he wasn't hurting anyone. Even when he stayed up late one night to slaughter the neighbor's dog, who was prone to barking until the wee hours of the morning from the confines of his outdoor kennel, even then he did not see this as a harmful act. He was simply making things easier for everyone else in the neighborhood, doing their damnedest to get some sleep. As far as he was concerned, this was a public service. Yes, he had to drag the Labrador deep into the woods that night, as he could not risk any evidence alerting his parents to what they already suspected about him, but having buried the gory remains deep enough into the earth, the neighbors would ultimately assume that their pet had just gotten loose and run off. This would be another moment that trained him in the art of deception and hiding his emotions. When the neighborhood was practically littered with posters bearing the image of the missing dog, he would catch the sideways glance of his parents on occasion as they attempted to read his face. and he was certain that they worried that he had been responsible for this, as he had expressed frustration about the incessant barking in recent weeks, another slip that showed him to keep his damn mouth shut. But after a few weeks, with his performance not letting up for a second, he could sense their posture relaxing when passing by the posters taped to trees and lampposts on the street. Even with these fears and doubts about their child, the Thompsons never showed him anything but love and compassion. It wasn't as though they never disciplined him for normal events that just about any kid gets into during their growing pains, but they were as caring as any guardian could be. That year, though, their 13th Christmas as a family, and the first year of parenting an official teenager, would mark the end of both their compassion and their lives. Timothy had decided to stay awake that night of the 24th to once and for all put this myth to the test. This wouldn't be his first attempt to uncover the legend, but most of his previous attempts were thwarted by his cosplaying uncle, or simply slumber taking hold of the young boy, unable to last through the night. This year, however, he made certain to be well rested, to ensure that he would not only witness his idol at work, but have enough leftover energy to unwrap whatever goodies he had left him. Once the house fell silent, his parents asleep, and his uncle knocked out on the couch, Timothy watched through the window in search of any peculiar shadows drifting before the illuminated moon. With no sounds or distractions around him, no temptations to steal his focus, or ambient noises to drown out any potential hooves on the rooftop, he found his conviction faltering, his eyelids growing heavier, but he held strong, bound by determination. As the hours trickled by, the young boy began to worry that everybody had indeed been telling him the truth, that the myth was just a lie. That was until he caught something out of the corner of his eye, moving so quickly he could have blinked and missed it. When the blurry, unfocused shape landed on the roof of the house, paralleling the one from which he peered, he knew this had to be the man himself, along with those magical creatures guiding his sleigh. The fact that he could make out nothing solid or fully tangible, only an image barely present in this reality, this only fueled his belief in the magic and wonder of it all the more. As part of the image split from the hole, shooting into the chimney and back out over the course of maybe a second or two, the shadowed shape bounced onto the next house in line, then the next, following that same course before crossing the air above the street to the side his house was on. He couldn't make it out at this point, with it being on the end of the row of houses he occupied, even pressing his face to the glass, but after a time, he saw it coming closer again, his heart feeling as though it would burst from his hastened rate. When he could finally see it again, only just as it landed on the house right next to his own, he eagerly awaited the sound of its landing echoing through the ceiling. And he waited some more, reluctant to press his face to the glass again in fear of being discovered. For minutes, he just lay on his bed, unable to peel the smile from his face. But there were no sounds, neither from the roof nor the fireplace downstairs. Finally, edging closer to the window once more, he caught one last sight of that blurry shape speeding away from his street like a bullet fired across the night sky. Assuming that the jolly saint was as silent as he was imperceptible to the eye, the boy gently opened the door to his bedroom, sneaking down the stairs to take a peek at the wonders awaiting him beneath the Christmas tree. But there were none. He just stood there at the landing, stunned by the lack of presence, when the creaking door on the second floor caused him to almost leap out of his own skin. Quickly glancing back up to his room to see that he had indeed closed the door behind him, he slipped into the closet at the base of the stairs as swiftly and quietly as he could, leaving the door cracked ever so slightly. He watched on with his mouth agape as his parents descended the stairs, nudging his uncle when they reached the couch. As a weary and clearly exhausted group, they left the room, emerging some minutes later with armloads of wrapped presents, which had apparently been tucked away in the basement. "Okay," his father said with a winded chuckle. There's still a few hours to get some sleep before he wakes up. With that, they bid their goodnight to his mother's brother again and headed back upstairs. Josh practically fell onto the couch, pulling his blanket over himself, and was snoring within a few moments. Maybe 10 minutes trickled by before Timothy stepped back out of the closet, his face flushed from both the betrayal of Father Christmas in skipping his home to his family's further shenanigans and playing along with this ridiculous holiday tradition. Yes, he was well aware that his uncle had been playing the part for some time now, but to see them magically delivering the gifts after clearly receiving not one from the jolly fat man, the young boy could barely keep his composure, not even attempting to muffle his footsteps as he made his way back to his bedroom. For the next few hours, he still didn't sleep. He tried to, pushing his head beneath his pillow in an effort to drown out the laughing voices jeering from the back of his mind, but it was of no use. He just lay there, festering on this mockery of a holiday in which he swore he would never indulge again. But that festering only grew more intense, more hate-fueled and bitter, and far more furious. Just neglecting the holiday wasn't enough. Just ignoring the insult from both his family and the self-important prick who ran this bullshit season, that was not enough. They had to pay for what they did to him. They would all have to pay for making him look like a fool all of these years. And they were not the only ones who would feel Timothy's wrath. Taking a moment to simply gaze upon the grotesque scene before him, the petite bodies he had only just strewn apart, the man finally took the opportunity to glare over the railing at the ongoing celebration on the ground floor. Maybe 20 to 30 tiny partygoers danced, drank, and laughed in what appeared to be the main assembly room of this factory. While the machinery and tools looked quite foreign to the eyes of the man in the now positively blood-soaked coat, he gave no concern to how they actually made the toys that never quite made it to his childhood home. Yes, the stacks of already wrapped presents caused his face to flush all the more, the rage of the initial insult to his fragile emotions which sent him on this long journey growing more intolerable. But he was quickly distracted by the thought of the large room dripping with as much gore as his padded clothing. Though there was a decent amount of prey awaiting him downstairs, he felt that he could efficiently cut down every last one of them before they could even think about rising up against him. Up until now, he had taken one down at a time, exactly how he had planned out his assault on this town, but this seemed as good a time as any to take things to the next level. Peeling open his bag of goodies once more, slipping the heavy fire axe loose of its grip, and slinging the bag back over his shoulder, he gripped both the new tool in one hand and the dripping machete in the other. With one last glance over the railing, he nudged the still oozing elf next to the door out of the way and walked back through to descend the steps. By the time he reached the bottom floor again, his mouth was watering with the thought of the echoing screams and fluid spraying across the walls that lay just ahead. Walking down the short hallway, with the sounds of joy and laughter growing louder, he could feel his fingertips trembling with anticipation. The second he pushed through the door to see 3 giggling elves swaying from side to side, arm in arm, turning to face him, he just tilted his head, with a satisfied smile lifting the corner of his mouth and porcelain mask again. As the expression on the trio of tiny faces transitioned from jubilation to the sheer horror of what looked back at them, the imminent screams would not have the opportunity to leave their slack jaws. With one swift strike, the gore-lined blade sliced right through 2 necks before planting into the third. The one who was still standing, gurgling on his own blood, attempted to croak out words, But when the axe buried into the other side of his gullet, dropping his head beside the other two, rolling back and forth on the floor, this expression of shock would be frozen for posterity. With the dim and flickering lighting, combined with the loud music reverberating against the walls, the man was surprised to see that no one else had noticed his arrival. Not yet, anyway. As he plundered on, splitting the skull of his next victim in two, from forehead to chin, and thrusting his bloody blade into the guts of the one beside her, that first howl of terror almost caused his head to grow so light he feared he may pass out for a moment. When the shrieking witness, a somewhat stocky elf with braided blue hair, caught the attention of several others, who in turn joined said chorus of fear, the majority of the remaining eyes in the room turned to face the party pooper, dripping blood to the floor. He only smiled wider when little feet began to scamper in all directions, even if he did find himself a little aggravated by the fact he would now be forced to break one of the sacred traditions of masked killers, should he hope to silence them all quickly. He would have to transform his leisurely stroll into a run. As he sped from one victim to the next, having dropped his sack of toys to work as efficiently as possible, he wasted no time in violently putting an end to each and every one of them he could. He split the first in two at the waist, leaving its upper half coughing on the fluids spewing from her mouth. He severed skulls down the center, lopped off legs to dramatically slow the retreat of others, with plans to come back and finish them later. One poor elf who moved significantly slower than the others, being twice the girth of his average workmates, received a blade of the axe to the base of his spine, before the machete burst from his chest by way of his back. Some fell to the floor with their guts spilling out, their abdomens sliced wide. Others lost their heads at the neck, or was simply ran through with the tip of the gore-lined blade. As the crowd thinned, still with none having actually escaped the wide room, the man began to lessen his need for haste. Not only was he positively exhausted by this point, but he was truly perplexed by the sight of the little munchkins just running in circles rather than sprinting for the doors. Had the shock gotten the best of them? Were they too drunk to remember the way back out of the building? Did they actually want to die bloody? Shrugging off these passing whimsies, more focused on the delight of this mass slaughter, he decided to enjoy the remaining few, scampering around like kids hopped up on adrenaline and sugar. Sure, he still had a few writhing on the floor, awaiting his services to end their misery, but they weren't going anywhere. As he snatched another tiny citizen of Christmastown from the path she was attempting to run, dropping his tools momentarily, lifting her from the ground to stare directly into her horror-stricken, bright purple eyes, he offered a simple shh to her whimpers and pleas for mercy. Wrapping one hand around her left arm and the other around her right, he continued to stare her down as he pulled in opposing directions. The sound of her wails combined with the tissue tearing and the bones splitting as the left arm slowly gave way, the right not ripping quite as swiftly. As he finally tore the left free with a cracking pop, the tiny woman dangling by her ruined right, the man released his grip. The second she fell limp to the floor, he glared at his next, slack-jawed victim, not breaking his gaze as he pounded the skull beneath his foot. Crouching to pick his machete back up, still holding the torn limb in his other hand, he gingerly strolled to the one paralyzed with fear before him. With one quick thrust, he sank his blade into the belly of the white-haired male elf, draping the girl's limb over his own shoulder to grip his fingers around the upper and lower jaw in front of him. He pulled up and down simultaneously, peeling the mouth agape so wildly that the cheeks burst apart on each side. He released his grip on the other half, snatching the severed limb from across his shoulder. It took some work, some defeated swats from his victim, and a little extra elbow grease. But when he stepped back to admire his work, he couldn't help but chuckle at the splayed out fingers almost waving at him from the ruined mouth. With that one leaving him a bit winded, he took a moment to scan the room, seeking out either the sights or the sounds of any who may still remain. For the most part, the place had fallen silent. Even the music had been snuffed out at some point, though he was so focused on his work, he hadn't noticed that until this point. Seeing not a trace of anyone, with the only sounds being the ambient dripping of blood to the hardwood floor, he closed his eyes to lend all he had to his hearing. While the fairly constant flow of leaking fluids caused his heart rate to maintain its more hastened speed, his pulse thumping on his inner ear, he finally picked up on something. It wasn't much, but he had no doubt that the slightly muffled whimpering was coming from someone still alive out there. Though it was hard to keep his footsteps as quiet as he'd like, the veritable river of crimson gore causing every one of them to offer a light splat the closer he drew, the more confident he felt in the knowledge that they would not escape. When he rounded one of the larger machines, a red and white striped monstrosity of metal and PVC, he found his bloodshot eyes meeting those of an even smaller framed, curly pink-haired elf girl who appeared substantially younger than the rest. As he reached down to her, another scream echoed from behind, ramping up in volume quickly. Before he could turn around, he felt an exquisite, piercing sensation in his left butt cheek, inspiring a high-pitched shriek from his own mouth, catching both himself and the cowering girl by surprise. Whipping his body around to see a somewhat muscled little elf rearing back with a bloody pointed candy cane, readying for his next attack, the man just kicked his right leg up with everything he had. The little fella practically flew back a good 10 feet at least, landing on the ground with a cracking pop. Seeing the tiny person struggling to lift himself back to his feet, the man snatched the girl up by her head, his hand encasing her entire skull, before he strolled toward the victim of his energetic kick. "Stay," he grunted, after dropping the one he held, her eyes watering as she glared back up at him. Once he felt secure that she wouldn't scamper off, he leaned down to lift the one still twitching on the ground, wrapping his wide hand around both of his ankles. "Don't fucking move," he said to the girl as he walked back toward that massive machined monstrosity, dragging the male elf through the sticky fluids on the floor. Though she obeyed his command, staying put in that same spot he had dropped her, that didn't prevent a near ear-piercing squeal to howl from her gaping mouth when the man swung the little elf against the hardened steel of the machine like a baseball bat to a tree trunk. Over and over again, he pounded the small-framed body against the veritable metal wall, every hit echoing a moistened, splatting crunch until it looked like a fleshy bag of pulverized meat and bone. Once he was content that not a fragment of life remained in the bloody sack of goo, he released his grip, strolling back to the last living creature in the room, beside himself, of course. "Go," he said, glaring down at the violently trembling girl. "Go, find your boss. Tell him someone's here to see him." She didn't move, other than the involuntary twitching and spasming, just stared up at him, sobbing so hard that she gasped for breath. "Go!" he shouted, causing her to practically leap out of her skin. "Go now, or you're next." Whether it was the volume and hatefulness of his words, the rage-filled look in his eye, or the blood still streaming from his fingers that did the trick, she took off like a bat out of hell, almost slipping and stumbling on the gore several times before bursting through the door at the rear of the room. While he awaited his final victim of the night, the one he had dreamt of bleeding dry for decades now, he took a leisurely saunter around the room, gathering up his discarded tools and swiftly silencing those who still barely gripped onto life. The night's climax was upon him. The grand finale of this most wonderful night. After this, the first Christmas he had celebrated for many years, He would finally look forward to this time of year again, something that brought him quite the satisfied smile as he took a seat, favoring his right, to ease his aching back and oozing butt cheek. Timothy Thompson did not sleep at all the night of the 24th, back in 1989. Though the part of him that still held on to childhood longed to see what his parents had bought him for Christmas, fully accepting that the man in the red hat gave him absolutely nothing all these years, his rage was overpowering that last remaining flicker of joy. He wanted to punish them all for every lie they had ever told him, for making him look like a complete idiot all these years, still believing in this ridiculous holiday, while other children had learned the truth so much sooner. The cruel irony, which inspired all the more contempt from the bitter teenager, was that those who didn't believe likely still got something from the sleigh. They mocked him for believing in that festive fuck, but they still got a nice kid gift, while he got jack shit. As the minutes inflated, each feeling like a gargantuan grotesquerie of time, his hatred grew stronger and more bitter until he could contain it no longer. Since before he was old enough to remember, he had tortured and tormented any woodland animal unfortunate enough to cross his path. Tonight would be the night he upgraded his tendencies. Creeping back downstairs to see his uncle still snoring on the couch just across from the fireplace, Timothy already had his plan forged. Though he wanted to see the shocked look on that smug face, he wasn't a complete fool. He knew that his proportions were far too small to put up any sort of a fight if the sleeping man awoke. With that, after slipping the fire poker from the rack beside the fireplace, he gently lifted the coffee table to one side to give him plenty of room to make that first swing count. His uncle did not stir. He did not twitch or move in any way, even when the hooked end of the iron rod pierced his right temple. While the boy was certain that first swipe did the trick, that euphoric sensation was not yet satisfied, nor was the still building rage. 10 more times he beat that rod against the skull, gushing more blood to the sofa and carpet with every strike, each hit more powerful than the last. When the head of the man who had portrayed jolly old St. Nick for the past 6 years was reduced to nothing more than fragmented bone, flesh, and oozing viscera, Timothy decided to take a moment to catch his breath before ascending the steps to his parents' room. As he sat there on his father's favorite recliner, cutting his eyes between the twitching corpse of his mother's brother and the twinkling lights of the tree, something else caught his attention. Something that inspired his face to burn so brightly he feared that his skin would catch fire. The half-drank glass of milk next to the small ceramic plate, a single chocolate chip cookie with one bite removed from it, only fueled the perversion of a performance his family had played all these years. Any lingering doubts he had about brutally removing his parents from his life once and for all completely drifted away as he glared contemptuously at this bitter sight. Again, Timothy was an intelligent boy, always had been. A sick, twisted, disgusting, and perverse child, yes, but an intelligent one nonetheless. He had to believe that even if he put a swift end to his father, this would awaken his sleeping mother. He had to make it fast, catch them both off guard and surprised. Back in this day and age, even the most responsible and loving parents were not prone to keeping their firearms under lock and key. Perhaps had things been different back then, at least one of the Thompson parents might have survived that night. It didn't take long for Timothy to locate the rifle that his father kept in the basement. Sure, it was in a glass cabinet along with a few other weapons, but this particular gun was the one that the boy had always had his eye on, even if his old man would never let him even hold it. He knew that his folks knew about his darker half, something that caused him to roll his eyes at their blatant irresponsibility in keeping this cabinet unlocked, even if that was the way of things. Honestly, he wondered why they even kept such weapons in the house, given the nature of their youngest family member. But this would still make things easier for him in the long run. What did not help his situation, however, when he heard the scream bellowing out from beyond the stairs he had descended to reach the basement, was that at least his mother was no longer sleeping soundly. Of course, while he tiptoed up the steps after loading a few shells into the rifle, he was alright with this. This would allow him to witness that shocked expression that his uncle had been able to provide. As he snuck back through the door, gently pacing back toward the room in which his father glared down at what remained of his brother-in-law, and his mother attempting to command her shivering fingers to operate the rotary phone on the side table, the small-framed teenager did not hesitate. The receiver fell from his mother's grip when her husband dropped to the carpet, the left side of his head having been exploded by the bullet. Timothy just glared, dumbstruck for a moment, not at the awful fact that he had just murdered his loving father, but at the impressive gravity of the wound inflicted by just one round. As he drifted his gaze from the corpse of his old man to the wide, horrified, and truly betrayed eyes of his mother, he just offered her a shrug before he raised the still smoking barrel of the rifle and squeezed the trigger once more. With him being completely inexperienced in shooting, that first shot being more prepared and a bit of dumb luck on his behalf, this shot wasn't quite as accurate as its predecessor, but it still got the job done. Enough, anyway. Or so he thought. When she fell back, knocking over the table that held the rotary phone, her son lost sight of her for a moment. When he paced closer to ensure that she was gone, the rifle now trembling in his grip, his own jaw fell loose before he could send that final round into her face. As she lay there, her stomach gushing blood to the carpet, her wound was not the only thing she held onto. Though her voice was barely a strained whisper as she attempted to speak into the mic of the phone, it was clear that, in those final moments, she had succeeded in getting her last call to go through. The second he saw this, he finished her off, sending fragments of the first face he had seen in this world splattering across the curtains. His mind racing as much as his heart, he battled to figure out his next steps. Certain that his mother had summoned the authorities with the final breaths his stupidity and haste had allowed her to take, he knew that he couldn't linger, but he couldn't rush out into the snow in his pajamas either. Moving as quickly as he could, he packed a bag, stumbling over his pants as he attempted to dress himself in the process. While he briefly considered playing the part of an unsuspecting and traumatized child whose parents had just been killed by a ruthless home invader, he could not believe that would be enough for the police. He couldn't know how much his therapist would be permitted to say, nor if the evidence would speak for itself. No, he had to run, to get the hell away from here and never look back. The sounds of sirens echoing from outside practically ricocheted against the inner walls of his chest as he loaded his Christmas presents into a garbage bag, but as soon as they were loaded up, he sprinted through the back door before he could be bound and shackled. The following few years were somewhat chaotic for the young man. He lived on the streets for a time, still feeding his growing impulses on some poor, unsuspecting, and kind-natured people who would attempt to help him out. Sometimes he would break into houses, swiftly silencing their occupants and camping out for a while, but he never stayed in one place for long. At around 15, he ended up in an orphanage in central Missouri. While living there, he learned to drive and managed to further his education, but he would have to put his hobbies on hold. He couldn't risk bringing any attention to himself by obviously lessening the numbers of his fellow residents, but he had grown tired of all the moving about, so he was glad to have a place to call home for the first time in years. Of course, when he was finally ready to leave this place, right around the Christmas season of 1994, he left the walls as bloody as every other house in which he had lived. Though this was the result of both the festive wishes and having been on the wagon for so long, it would be his greatest mistake. The 3-level house contained so many more victims to quench his thirst, he spent far more time indulging than intended. He couldn't silence them all quickly enough, and though he was more intelligent than the average 18-year-old, he had grown arrogant. He had so much blood on his hands by this point, he almost believed he was immortal, that he had become a veritable demon through his crimes. It wasn't until he attempted to flee, with bullets firing from multiple directions behind him, when he would learn that, somehow, be it Christmas magic or some unspoken pact with the devil himself, he may not have been far off in his subconscious assessment. No less than 7 bullets entered his back as he burst through the rear door of the old house, sending him tumbling to the snowy ground outside. Blue and red lights were only a blur to his muted senses as he hovered between this world and the dark underbelly to which he was bound. But this would not be the end of Timothy Thompson. With no way of knowing how much time had passed when he awoke in the darkness, his body feeling somewhat restricted, he had no idea of what was going on. Finally, understanding that he was confined in some sort of bag, he managed to peel it open, finding himself naked and bloody in a cold, dark room. It took him a while to locate any sort of clothing, and mostly just discarded garments of the dead, not yet thrown into the garbage or incinerated. But after that, it didn't take him long to escape the building and the state in which he fell. Filled with the conviction that he was indeed on the path he was supposed to follow, the fact that he had somehow avoided death assuring him that he must continue, Timothy spent years honing his craft. He bled the remainder of the 90s and the early 2000s, both avoiding capture and the Reaper himself. During this time, when he wasn't soaking the walls and floors with gore and viscera, he was investigating everything he could learn about the true location of the only target he had so passionately wished to end. That was no easy task, mind you, but such entities being proven real from such an early age assured the madman that others had to know him to exist as well. He tortured everything from religious authorities to high-ranking government officials, milking every drop of knowledge he could learn. As the year reached the beginning of the 3rd decade of the 2000s, he had narrowed down the location of his quarry. Having garnered quite the abundance of wealth through his lifelong endeavor, it wasn't difficult to arrange passage to the Northern Hemisphere. From there, with all the supplies a person could need for braving the otherwise desolate area, he spent the following months traversing the vicinity. One bitter night in early November, after having decided to pack in his search for the night, he finally caught sight of something he was certain to mean he was close. A trio of small people wearing vibrant clothes not nearly thick enough to brave the chilling temperature. Not only that, but they were leading what looked to be an animal across the snow, a single reindeer, with what Timothy could swear to be a glowing red nose, but that could have just been his excitement getting the better of him. He stalked from behind, dressed head to toe in white camouflage, following them until they vanished before his eyes. As he hastily scampered to where the tiny footprints just stopped, he hesitantly eased his head forward. As he could feel the air shift around his ears, as though they crossed some sort of precipice, he gazed on in wonder as his eyes met the quaint and pleasant village, somehow protected from the chilling wind from beyond. Over the next month, he prepared for this very night, the night on which he would finally complete his life's work. Though he would not exactly retire after this, to rest his weary bones and step back from his path of carnage, he knew that he would rest soundly after he finished this. That he would finally be at peace, or whatever would qualify as such for such a demented and twisted mind.
What in the name of God?
A deep voice echoed across the room, the man in the blood-soaked coat snapping back to the reality before him as he gazed upon the one he had sought to meet his whole life. He didn't speak as he raised to his feet, only pulled his crowbar from the bag while still clutching his precious machete.
Who are you?
The bearded man asked, his eyes wide and leaking from the sights before him. It wasn't until that point when Timothy realized that he was still wearing his mask. While he had felt his expression shift from stoic to jubilant throughout the night, he completely neglected the fact that his victims couldn't see this, something that inspired a hollow chuckle as he approached the man wearing a strikingly similar coat to the one now drenched in the guts of elves. The closer he stalked to his prey, the further the saint backed away. They followed this course until they walked back out into the night air, the fresh oxygen breathing into the man's lungs in the most intoxicating way. Though he loved the smell of death, adored it almost more than air, there was nothing like this transition back into the outside world once the job was done. Yes, this particular job wasn't finished just yet, but that didn't make the sensation any less wonderful. The streets were vacant, aside from the occasional terrified elf peering out from one open door or another. Of course, there could have been a veritable throng of onlookers for all the man cared, as he gazed upon the disgusted expression of the one he planned to rip from this world with more brutality than any who had come before.
Why are you doing this?
The bearded man asked, his voice cracking. Because you're a lie. Because you're a lie this world doesn't need, the man replied, finally slipping his mask away, dropping it to the snow.
My God. Timothy Thompson.
You know my name, huh? Know who I am? Do you know what you did to me?
What I did to... I did nothing, child.
You skipped me, year after year. You fucking skipped me, left me with nothing, while I believed in you, while I defended you like a damned idiot, you ignorant...
Nothing. You received presents every single year, young man. You got more than many children could ever hope for.
Not from you.
Oh, Timothy, you sick, twisted boy. Your parents loved you. They gave you all they had and more. All the love they had to give and everything you could ever need. Everything but the discipline you so desperately deserved.
You think a spanking here and there would have made me turn out different? Timothy said, laughing condescendingly.
No. Perhaps not. You were wrong from the start. Some people are simply born bad.
You ain't got no right to talk about what's right and wrong, you fat fuck. Why, you just skip over the houses of kids you don't like? Don't even give them the courtesy of a lump of fucking coal?
The coal thing is a myth, actually,
the bearded man said, his tense demeanor suddenly dropping to one simply making small talk.
You see, not granting presents to inherently bad children is not a punishment, you understand. Honestly, with so many homes to visit, it would simply be a waste of time for me to go to the extent of dropping off coal. You see, we do not punish children here. We simply reward the good children for, well, being good children.
The jovial chuckle he let out with those words positively infuriated the man who found his face burning again. Who are you to decide who is naughty and nice, huh?
It is not I who decided this, young Timothy, but you. You and all the other children of the world. Some are taught to be hateful through the cruel actions of those tasked with raising them, Some make it through those times and find balance. Some, well, not so much. As it happens, we still provide gifts to those who still have a chance, those who can still change. Unfortunately, these presents don't always make it into the hands they were meant for. Some parents can be so cruel, but I like to think that we have helped a good many find their way. You, however, and so many more like you, perhaps not quite as sinister, of course. For you, there is no redemption. You, Timothy Thompson, should simply never have been born.
You smug son of a bitch. Yeah, you think you're so much better than me, huh? Yeah, you'll see. After tonight, after I smear your stain from this fucked up world, it'll be a better place.
Oh, really? Is that right?
Oh yeah. By the time the sun comes back up, you ain't never ruining another kid's Christmas ever again.
Maybe so. Maybe so.
The jolly man said, unbuttoning his coat and slipping it from his surprisingly muscled shoulders.
Well, between now and then, before you smear my stain away.
He rolled his shoulders, tilting his head from one side to the other with a loud crack.
I'm gonna fuck you up.
With that, Timothy saw this as his cue that no more words were necessary. Screaming with all the rage this damned seasonal saint had caused him, he charged forward, raising his machete high and striking down the second he closed the gap. When Nicholas raised his arm, the blade burying into his veined and muscled forearm, Timothy was completely caught off guard when the fist met his jaw with so much force it sent him a good 5 feet back, his back planting to the snow.
You shouldn't fight when you're angry,
St. Nicholas said, pulling the machete from his arm and tossing it aside.
Makes you sloppy.
As he glared down to the blood smeared across his knuckles, then to his leaking forearm, almost severed in two, he did the strangest thing. Timothy had no idea what to even think as the big guy smeared the blood now leaking from his own mouth upon the deep cleft on his opposing arm, but he didn't have time to care about that.
Try again,
Mr. Claus said, flexing the fingers of both hands. Lifting himself back up, cutting his eyes to the machete lying on the snow and down to the crowbar he still held, he vowed that he would not be caught by surprise for a second time. Sure, he had allowed himself to get a bit cocky, having laid waste to so many easy prey throughout the night, but he had no doubt he could take this jolly bastard. As he charged the man again, this time aiming to pierce his gut with the pointed tip of the only other weapon he held, he could barely believe how quickly his target moved, wrapping his fingers around the crowbar before it could hit its mark, but that left him an opening, one that he used to ram his elbow upward against that bearded chin. Certain that he had knocked the big guy silly with that hit, he stepped back, releasing his grip on his weapon, prepared to slug a dent into the face before him. Of course, when he glanced back up at his would-be victim, to see him not even having flinched, he hesitated for long enough to be caught off guard once again. The muscled, bearded man whose tight tank top looked as though it could easily rip free from the tension around his sizable gut and massive chest moved so quickly that Timothy didn't have a chance to react. Before he knew it, the pointed tip he had attempted to stab into the belly of the beast was rammed right through his own upper thigh, something that inspired him to scream from the shock as much as the pain. With another powerful strike to his face, Nicholas sent the lifelong serial killer back to the snow, this time leaving his nose almost flattened to his face. His head was spinning, his eyes feeling crossed as he shakily propped himself upon his elbows, glaring back at his target with his heart racing for a very different reason now.
You probably shouldn't pull that out,
Mr. Claus said, gesturing to the metal rod sprouting from the upper thigh.
No telling if I might have nicked an artery or not.
What the hell are you? Timothy asked, glaring at the man in both shock and awe in equal measures.
Probably something you should have looked into before you came all this way.
The two just glared at each other again, Timothy's eyes wide and trembling, and those of the saint of the season stoic and still.
I wasn't always like this, you know.
Mr. Claus began, wiping the remaining blood from his no longer split arm.
Not too long ago, I was held together by thread and spare parts, but elven magic is an ever-evolving and most fascinating thing. That in itself is so much older than this village, and shall continue for long after it has become one with the snow. You see, they are the ones who provide the power of this place and the seasonal traditions we embrace. You, young Timothy, are something supernatural yourself. The depth and magnitude of your inherent evil, allowing your pitiful life to continue even after sustaining damage. But it takes time, doesn't it?
Quickly tiring of this pointless sermon and hopeful to catch the gloating man off guard, Timothy leapt to his feet, attempting to keep any weight off his injured leg as he pushed forward. Once again, this did not go as he hoped. In one swift motion, he whipped a concealed dagger from the inside of his coat, thrusting it before him in the direction of the throat beneath the white curly beard. As it was, the sharpened steel did not make its mark before Nicholas snatched the forearm as it sped at him, twisting his wrist and snapping the bones within like sun-dried twigs. Still holding the shattered limb, he beat his fist against Timothy's jaw, his gut, and his left temple, slamming his foot down on the knee, not covered in its own blood, snapping the kneecap in its center. The blood-soaked man fell back to the snow, digging into the cobblestones beneath in an attempt to drag himself away from the one looking down on him, his gaze horror-stricken at the strength and speed of this man.
You do understand that you are not the first to attempt something like this, yes?
Timothy didn't speak, his mind unable to conjure even the weakest of retorts. With a muffled moan, he twisted his arm back into what he hoped to be the right position, biting down all the more as he flipped his leg straight too. Having no concrete idea of how his own body repairs itself, nor how long it may take for bones to piece themselves back together, the only hope he had left was to wait.
I don't know, maybe 250 years ago, someone else like you made their way up here. Back then, we weren't as hidden as we are now. Didn't need to be. I imagine it didn't take them as long to track me down, but they headed straight to my home when they got there. That cowardly son of a bitch hacked me to pieces as I lay sleeping beside the missus. I still took him down, but back then, I didn't bounce back quite as well as I do now. The elves hadn't learned certain talents at this point either, but they pieced me back together with parts borrowed from the one who left me in that state. In all honesty, before these mystical little creatures did what they could to preserve my life, I thought about just packing it in, taking this brutal mutilation as a sign to finally let go of my life and be at peace. But it was my wonderful wife who reminded me that even if I must allow myself to become a physical abomination, I must do what I had to, that I could not abandon the children over some missing bits and pieces. For a long time, I went on like that, a veritable abomination of spare parts and thread. But I'll give it to Mrs. Claus. She stayed by my side through all of it. In a strange way, this awful, awful event only made our love stronger. Bless that amazing woman. She keeps me young, I tell you.
Timothy became aware of a scuffling sound coming from the large building to his back, but that wouldn't distract him either. Though he knew that his broken bones would not allow him to put any weight on those limbs as he pressed his bleeding leg against the snow, he felt assured that he could use that foot to launch him forward. He just had to wait for the opportune moment. He wouldn't be so hasty this time. He was smarter than that. Sure, this arrogant prick before him had centuries to train his reflexes, but Timothy had something over him. He was relentless. He was cold. He knew how to kill like possibly no one else ever had. Plus, he had a few more goodies stashed away within his padded coat.
As the years passed by, I learned that grown adults could stand to learn a lesson or two, and my borrowed parts didn't have quite the lifespan of those with which I was born.
I thought you said you don't punish folks, Timothy butted in, both to distract from digging in his coat, and out of outrage at another lie.
We don't punish children. Naughty adults are a different story. I must say, though, I did consider visiting you once or twice through the years, but I wasn't certain if I wanted any of your bits stitched upon me. Your predecessor was a necessity, and I could feel him festering within me. But you? Well, I had a feeling that we would meet someday.
As the big guy looked away in disgust, perhaps out of actual disgust or just to further illustrate his contempt, Timothy would not waste the small window of opportunity. He quickly whipped the revolver from the holster hidden beneath his coat, instantly firing off every round the second that beard turned to face him again. When Nicholas fell back upon the snow, Timothy let out a victorious squeal, pounding his one functional arm against the ground, cackling like the madman he was. After this bout of celebratory hilarity, he shuffled across the snow, his heart quickening all the more with the thought of that vacant stare frozen upon the face of the mythical Santa Claus. As he gazed down upon that empty glare, his own enthusiastic smile practically muting the pain of his screaming limbs, he felt a warmth blossom from within that he had never before known. Not only had he finally fulfilled his goal, but as he flexed his fingers and toes, he felt assured that he may be able to put pressure on his limbs again. He took his time climbing back to his feet. His knee was still dreadfully stiff and tender, but nothing he couldn't handle. All he had left to do was make his way back out of this town, hope that his snowmobile hadn't been buried beneath the snow, and head back to civilization. With how energized this most recent kill had left him, he knew that he could handle the daunting journey from here. Yes, he had not expected this to be as much of a challenge, all things considered, but he would wear whatever scars remained with pride. Pride for a job well done, and a destiny fulfilled. The sight that greeted him as he turned back to face the massive factory he had left lined with gore and guts, however, froze every ounce of the blood speeding through his veins. There were only a few of them at first, the somehow reanimated, eviscerated townsfolk that he had torn apart, shambling through the open door of the factory, but more staggered out behind them. Each of them still wore the grizzled and grotesque wounds he had carved into them, tendrils of meaty and moist tissue, steadily pulling their missing parts back into one solid structure. But the gaping mouths, drooling with feral crimson and saliva, and hauntingly empty eyes glaring back into his own, left his own guts bubbling. One blood-soaked elf dragged himself through the snow, the one whose legs had been brutally amputated near the beginning of this journey through the mill, the discarded limbs trailing behind as they attempted to reconnect. The little female elf, who he had split in two from shoulder to hip, her upper half was still hanging loose while her body slowly zipped itself back shut, offered him a sinister smile as she approached. The one who had arrived to rendezvous with her, his head still an unrecognizable mass of bone and meat, held the portion of his head which had been torn away in place while it worked on mending itself. They all seemed to be emerging from the structure in the order in which he had ended them, or thought he had. But it wasn't hard for him to realize that this was due to the fact that those who fell first began to rebuild before the others. Even those he had snuffed out upon entering this town, those he murdered in their sleep, came stumbling around the side of the building. The one with whom he took his time was barely recognizable as anything humanoid in its appearance, all of the many bits and pieces patched together like a grotesque jigsaw. But within moments, each and every victim he had gouged, pierced, torn, and tortured glared at him from a veritable throng. Had he not been in so much shock at the time, the sight of the elf with the split-apart mouth pulling out the severed arm which was forced down his gullet would have made Timothy chuckle at such a bizarre vision. When the small-framed girl whipped a limb from his grip, holding it to her torn shoulder while it reattached, wearing a particularly annoyed expression, the one whose cheeks steadily sealed back shut just offered her a defeated shrug.
Elven magic.
The familiar, deep voice spoke from his back, inspiring him to spin around to seek out its source.
It's a hell of a thing.
Timothy screamed out a hopeless and horrified wail as he once more glared into those bright blue eyes of the jolly old saint of the season, the one whose spiteful gaze held no joy, only the pensive stare of determination. With one more desperate attempt to survive this night, the man who thought he could end Christmas once and for all reached into his coat again, pulling out a small pocket knife. Flipping it open, he swiped it toward the stoic face, which was still in the process of ejecting the bullets that had been fired into it. Nicholas didn't even flinch when the cold steel buried into his neck. He didn't look away, wince, or writhe, only continued to glare contemptuously into the eyes of the one who could not take a hint. As Timothy yanked the knife back, moving in for a second strike, this would not go as he hoped. Mr. Claus snatched the man's wrist, violently twisting it until its attacker released the blade with a pain-stricken squeal. Letting go of the arm he held, he then wrapped his fingers around Timothy's throat, punching him right in the center of his gaping mouth with his other fist, once, and once again. As Timothy's mind swayed from one side to the other, his senses spinning and his vision blurring, he was barely aware when the fist, which had been pounding his face, wrapped around his crotch before the bearded man lifted him from the ground. For a moment, he just held him there, gripped by his throat and undercarriage, the crowd of broken elves cheering at the sight. When he felt his body swiftly speeding back down, he would not connect directly to the padding of the thick layer of snow. When Santa Claus practically folded his would-be murderer across his knee, Timothy felt the excruciating agony for only a second. The sound of his spine shattering finally overcame that ringing sound in his dizzy head before he slumped back to the ground, all feeling below his swelling face completely fading away.
You see,
Nicholas began again, wiping his large hand across the blood trickling from Timothy's twitching mouth before applying it to his neck and each of his still fresh bullet wounds.
it took the elves a long time to figure out how to evolve the spell they had cast on me in the beginning of all of this. At the start, when we all chose to take on this mission of spreading joy to the children of the world, they merely extended my years to mimic their own immortality. They could always heal from just about anything, but back then, they didn't know how to fully grant me that ability. I would live indefinitely, yes, but I had to heal from any injuries in the normal human fashion. It was only a few years back when they discovered another aspect of their inherent gifts after patching me back together for centuries. It was the blood, you see. Both Twinkle and I were working on a project together when a small accident occurred, cutting into my still human arm and hers simultaneously. While they can repair themselves from just about any sort of damage, it does take some time, not unlike how you heal, Timothy Thompson. But when my blood fell into her open wound, it sealed back shut within seconds. With this new sprinkling of knowledge, these wonderful little people were able to put the puzzle pieces together to restore me to my former glory, though it was quite the painful procedure, I must say. Given my body being something of a Frankenstein by this point, they had to remove all of the tainted sections before enacting the spell to make me whole again. But once it was done, I found myself able to repair in the same manner as them, both naturally and more swiftly, with the aid of blood.
Timothy had no words to offer as the crowd of strewn apart, grotesquely mangled townsfolk gathered around him, forming a makeshift circle. He just cut his gaze between all of those contemptuous eyes glaring back down at him.
On any normal day, we could simply allow them the time to heal. But as you know, this is no normal day. We still have a lot to get done before the hour groweth late. Hopefully, your body still contains enough for everyone.
The only saving grace that Timothy could find as the many fingers began to claw into his flesh from head to toe was that his spine had not yet begun to repair, that he couldn't feel most of his meat being stripped down to the bone below his neck. In a sick and twisted way, you couldn't help but wonder if this was one final, parting gift from the big guy, to spare him the agony of being ripped apart. Even if he had never earned a present until now, he was grateful for this one. The more of him that was torn away, the more he could feel his consciousness fading, until the darkness consumed him completely. By the time that all that remained of Timothy Thompson, the man who had strewn apart victims across the United States for the better part of 30 years, was a dried-out skeleton covered in clumps of grizzled meat and viscera, the sun was beginning to rise on the small town hidden away in the North Pole.
Whew.
A slender, green-haired elf said, glaring at the mess upon the snow.
Yeah, he ain't coming back from that.
Nicholas chuckled.
You're not wrong.
The group all glared up at the tallest man in town, eagerly awaiting his instructions.
All right, boys and girls,
St. Nick said to his now fully rebuilt, extended family.
We have a lot to get done before tonight.
Want me to throw that in the incinerator?
A wide-eyed, grinning female elf said, smearing the fresh blood from her mouth with the back of her arm.
That would be delightful. Thank you, my dear, dear girl,
Santa said, offering her a genuine smile.
You should get some rest, boss,
she said as she gestured to her associates to aid her in the disposal.
Maybe just a short nap. I don't want to leave all of this to you. We've all had, well, quite the eventful night.
We can rest while you're busy later. You got a big night tonight. Can't disappoint the kiddos.
As the large man lifted his coat from the snow, pulled it back over his bulging shoulder, he gave one last proud glance back at the wonderful elves already hard at work, cleaning up the unexpected mess.
Merry Christmas, you incredible little creatures,
he said with a warm smile.
Merry Christmas!
Erupted from the townsfolk in response.
Now get some sleep, you crazy old bastard!
A squeaky voice echoed from the back of the group, inspiring a howl of laughter from both his colleagues and the man turning to head back to his home for a few hours. As Nicholas lay back down on the bed beside his beloved, she rolled over, draping her arm around him, a sensation of which he would never tire. He had a long night ahead, and though he would often toss and turn while attempting the final sleep before the season's climax, he had no issues in drifting away this time. It had been a long time since he enjoyed a good scrap,